I'm just going to go ahead and let the internet know that I'm live. So hopefully some people will come in to visit. I am feeling a little bit anxious today about streaming, so I hope you'll bear with me. Some days I have anxiety. If you happen to come in, please feel free to say hey in the chat. It's always nice to have an idea when somebody's actually popped in. I do monitor the chat the whole way through the stream, so. I am today mostly just going over like questions from Twitter and Google Plus, and that's always pretty fun. So hoping that some people stop in and contribute further questions along with them. I am drinking Red Bull at like 6 o'clock at night. This is very much not my norm. But I've just been, had a really stressful, intense day. And I also feel like I have a migraine coming on, and caffeine helps with that. So it's something. Also, sorry I'm sniffly. It's the time of year, I think. I don't feel sick or anything other than my normal stuff, so I think it's just some sort of sniffles from the weather or something. But for anyone who is new and has come in, welcome to Leading with Class streaming. I am Bree Bow Sheldon. I am the creator and presenter for Leading with Class, and in the streams that we do on Twitch, I typically either talk about the work that I'm doing for the show, which is available at patreon.com/leadingwithclass. I either, work on that while I talk about the work that I'm doing and answer questions, or I go through listener and viewer questions that I've gotten via Twitter, Google Plus, and so on. And today I have questions from Arlene Metter, who is a longtime supporter of myself and my work, and Ray Cox, who is the presenter for Insert Quest Here, which is a gaming podcast. I've been interviewed on the show a couple of times, and they are awesome. So, normally, I have a little bit of work to go over, but I'm kind of pending on a couple of things for the episodes, partially because the holidays are coming up and I don't want to dig in too much to anything and then end up leaving something forgotten. And I've been dealing with a lot scheduling-wise, but I have these series of questions, starting with the one from Arlene, that I wanted to try and give a suitably good response to. And hopefully I'll have the same positive result with Ray's. You'll note that on some of these I have already put in some commentary after some of Ray's questions. But I haven't on some of the others and on Arlene's, and that's because I was still kind of processing up until the start of the stream The question from Arlene is any tips on dealing with a player who thinks they're a leader, but is really getting the characters killed? And this is, it's a very sad question, but it's a very legit question. I think we've all had, you know, a player that was super enthusiastic and wanted to take charge, but kind of kept taking everyone down the wrong road. And there are a couple of ways that you can approach this kind of situation. And, like, some people won't like certain ones, some people will like others. Personally, my general approach is to, you know, communicate to the person that, you know, maybe their methods aren't working and see if they want to, like, change their procedures to, like, see if they can do a better job. If they have the enthusiasm for the role of leader in, you know, your game group or whatever, like, maybe helping to ensure that they're doing the right thing is, you know, the right option. So, as an example, say you have a very charismatic rogue character who this player, like, really wants to have kind of be the star of the show and take the lead. But they're really bad strategically, and they aren't quite, like, making the right decisions when it comes to the combats. One of the things that you could suggest is, you know, kind of suggest to them that they delegate a little to another player who is a little bit better at, like, strategy for dealing with the specific situations that they're struggling with in this combat. Or you could, you know, tell them that, like, what they're doing is going to take a different approach, and maybe they need to evaluate it from a strategic point of view and focus on, you know, the ways that they can do this in a more functional, structured way. And I think that, you know, some people won't like being approached and say, you know, have someone ask them to do something a different way. But if they want to be the leader, you can make it clear that, like, leaders are willing to change and grow and do things differently. And sometimes that means delegating if it's really outside of their wheelhouse. Sometimes that means just doing it a different way if it is, like, inside their wheelhouse and everything. It's not easy, I think, to kind of guide people to changing the way of doing things, especially whenever they think of themselves as a leader. But part of it is reframing what a leader is. I mean, leaders aren't always right. That's hard to believe by some people's standards, I think. But it's true. Leaders often make mistakes. Leaders often don't know all of the ways to do a thing. Leaders are often not experts. And especially not experts in all things. And that's why delegation exists. And that's why you still have to, as a leader, always be willing to learn and grow. So my biggest point of guidance would be to, you know, make it clear to them kindly that the processes they're using aren't working. Say, you know, like, hey, I know you really wanted to, you know, go down this, you know, darker path because your stealth abilities are much more effective. But that puts, you know, the fighter in greater danger because they don't have as good as stealth abilities. They can't sneak and hide like you can. So maybe why don't you try and find a, you know, compromise where they can, you know, potentially walk in a brighter area, or maybe have a torch or something like that, while you still hide in the shadows just off to the side, strategically ready to strike. And it sounds maybe complicated, but I think that it's a good approach to, like, get people to do things a little bit differently and to continue to encourage them to be a leader, but, you know, encourage them to do so in a way that isn't harming people. I'm so sorry, I'm so sniffly. So that would be my approach for someone who's a player who thinks they're a leader but is really just getting the character skilled. Hey there, thank you so much for stopping in. I hope that you enjoy what you hear while you're stopped in. So the next set of questions I have are from Ray Cox. And as a reminder, if you're in the chat, feel free to say something, to comment, to ask questions at any point. I do keep an eye on the chat. So the questions that Ray gave me are really broad in categories like stuff to talk about. And I think that they did a really good job of highlighting some stuff that we don't often talk about. And so, like, I didn't have a ton of time to prepare to answer these ahead of time. That's one of the perils of doing these kinds of questions and answers. But I'm going to do my best to answer what I can. And if you have any questions or need any clarification as I go through, please feel free. And if you watch this later and you have questions, you can always contact me on, tag me on Twitter or on Instagram, comment on our Patreon or on our YouTube videos. And you can also email leadingwithclass@gmail.com. So Ray's first question was, how do you tell a narrative that involves hierarchy without removing player agency? And this is a really complex question that I think can be approached in a bunch of different ways. And I'm going to try and keep it relatively simple and just kind of how I would approach it, based on, my background and my experiences. And I'm hoping that will be sufficient. And one of the things that I said in my notes right after it here is largely starting by gaining consent and using safety and consent tools in game will put you on the right track. There's a lot of things you can kind of accomplish as a group of players if you first gain consent and then reinforce that care for consent by having safety and consent tools in your game. And safety and consent tools include things like script change and the X card, lines and veils, and check-ins and stuff like that. Basically anything that can enable you to confirm that a person continues to be comfortable with a thing, and things that give you ways to resolve if something goes wrong, having communication after. So this would be like rap meetings and debriefs and stuff like that. So another thing that I said was to communicate clearly and use meta dialogue to keep people on the same page, engaged, and comfortable. And what I mean by meta dialogue is it does not matter to me how immersive you want your game to be. You can think that immersion is like the number one thing to experience in a game, to like totally lose yourself in the experience, right? The people that you're playing the game with matter more than that. Always and universally. Their well-being and their safety should always be paramount. So you should be willing to step out of the immersion if necessary to be careful and be caring. And meta dialogue is when you do things like you're in the middle of a really intense scene where you're giving orders from the perspective of a general to a private. And there's like a lot of fear in the air and it's intense and scary. And in what you do is you step out of character and you say, hey, are you okay? Or give a symbol or something like that. And when you do that, you get their confirmation, or if they object and say that they're not okay, you take action to resolve it before continuing play. And this is not always as fun, maybe, but I also don't think it's fun to play with people who are genuinely distressed and upset. So using meta dialogue is to step out and communicate outside of the game about the game. And I talked a little bit about this in the emotional intelligence episode of Leading with Class, where I say that, you know, emotional intelligence is a kind of metagaming, like it's a kind of meta technique. And I also talk about like different things you do in the game that are meta to, you know, play and manipulate what's happening in game. And if we are willing to metagame to get what we want most out of the game, specific emotional responses or specific rewards, it is also important that we be willing to step out to meta game in order to protect each other and respect each other. And especially with stuff like, you know, structured hierarchy in games where there's going to be, you know, risks of reward and punishment and different types of power engaged. Like in the power episode, we talked about like legitimate power and coercive power and reward power. All of those things are factored in hierarchies. And when you do those things in game, like when you include them, you need to make sure that you are willing to, you know, take the actions to protect each other and to respect each other as people, because the hierarchy may apply in game and it may happen to the characters, but the hierarchy should not be affecting the players themselves. You can have player agency while having their characters go through struggles and trauma and things like that. And part of how you do that is you recognize, you know, that they have consent that they can give or revoke, and you set up tools to use, like script change and stuff like that, and you actually use them. You actively use them as part of the game to make sure that those people are protected. And you understand that if a person says no, as a player, then what happens to their character is changed because of that. So that would be my biggest thing, is to make sure you use the tools that we have at our disposal. Build your new tools if you need to like facilitate your particular game or your particular play experience. But be willing to meta the situation, like metagame, have meta dialogue, and always prioritize the person over the game. Because no story is worth hurting someone. So I hope that is useful and a valuable way to look at telling a narrative with hierarchy without removing player agency. So one of the things that Ray asks here is actually super important and also a kind of challenging thing to respond to because it takes a reframing. And the question is, how can we explore leadership in adventure RPGs like D&D without making one player seem more important? And again, part of this is reframing. Leadership is not only accessible to people who are in leadership roles. We all learn leadership skills in various types of roles, even if they're subordinate. So you could actually have no leader at your table really at all, and yet everyone is having the opportunity to learn leadership skills. So this would be people are learning active listening, people are learning resource allocation, people are learning, you know, decision making and everything. And also, one of the things that you learn as a leader is how to collaborate. And taking action to collaborate is very challenging sometimes for people in leadership roles. So you can actually explore more whenever you're doing it from a perspective of a group of people all working together. I mean, imagine it's not much different than certain communist or socialist type perspectives on decision making and basically like actions being taken. You can have a committee making decisions and they're all being leaders at that same time. And there's also things like shared leadership where you take turns. doing different things. Like, you highlight people to let them be a leader in a given situation because of their, you know, really specific skill set. And then the next time you focus on someone else because, you know, they, you know, have that ability. And whenever you, you know, also encourage them to do things as leaders that, like, delegate or collaborate or communicate outward skills needed, kind of things like that, it's a lot easier if you try and approach things from the perspective of, you know, leaders are not an island. They need to share their workload. They need to make decisions as a group. And they, you know, need to have the opportunity to kind of share the load, as it were. Even Frodo did not get the ring to Mordor on his own, kind of thing. He had someone to help him. And many people helping him from afar. So, and yes, and I am literally framing Frodo Baggins as a leader. He did things that took leadership skills and abilities, and so did Sam, and Pippin, and Merry, and Gandalf, Aragorn, and so on. You have to look at the fact that leadership skills are not exclusive to leadership roles, and that part of being a leader is sharing the load. If I was, like, doing a video, there's this really, like, silly gif of Samwise saying share the load in slow-mo while Frodo's, like, freaking out. And I was like, that's what it is. You know, you gotta share that load a little bit. I'm actually just going to quickly take quick notes here. So leadership is not exclusive to leadership roles. So everyone can be exploring leadership even if they are subordinate or sharing responsibilities. Leadership also includes sharing the load as part of its purpose. So delegation and shared responsibilities are part of it. So you really have to make a concerted effort, I think, to not, like, focus too heavily on one player. And this is, like, something we're guilty of doing even when we're not focusing on leadership. If somebody is, like, really charismatic, we tend to, like, lean towards them in the narrative a lot of the time. So it's just a conscious effort to reframe things and focus on things in a different way. So in chat, there's a question, not necessarily game related, but what's the difference between a leader and a manager? We always ask that when promoting people. I know what I think, but I'd also love to hear what you think. Well, thank you for wanting to know my perspective. I appreciate that. So leaders can be managers, managers can be leaders, but managers are not the same as leaders by default. They're not the same thing. So a manager, like, managing is a skill set. And so is leadership, really. Managing is kind of, I think I actually talk about this, like, in one of the early Leading with Class episodes to, like, differentiate for people. Managing is really effectively the tasks that you are doing, either as a leader or not. Because leadership really involves a lot of engagement with your own behavior. It involves mindfulness. You have to do things like, you know, kind of focusing on a mission and stuff like that. While management is about, like, the execution of the tasks that sometimes come with leadership, like resource management and allocation of man hours, things like being able to run an office. That's a management skill that leaders can have. And it's really not like one is better than the other in any way. They're just very different things that happen to overlap at times. And so I think that the big difference between a leader and a manager is a leader is one set of skills that are focused typically more on bigger picture and on like vision and mission and stuff like that. And a manager is someone who is focused on the more resource tasks and who is focused on, you know, accomplishing, you know, the work that's put in front of them that may or may not have to do with, you know, the huge vision and mission that are planned out beyond these are parts of that whole. I hope that makes sense. I hope that that is clear. Because like I think that managers are great, I think that leaders are great, and I think that sometimes they overlap, but they are to me very different. Great, thank you so much. I often say that a lot of GMs are managers but not leaders because they don't focus on developing leadership skills, some of which are things like, you know, active listening and emotional intelligence and stuff like that. Things that some managers have, but not all. So it is 6:26. Okay, we still have plenty of time. So Ray's next question, and I appreciated this one, is it necessary to have a party or team leader in military and adventure RPGs? And I would personally say no. You can have shared leadership and responsibilities within a group, even in those kind of contexts. A good example that I'd like to use is a game that my husband, who also works on the show, John W. Sheldon, is working on Roar of Alliance, which is a World War II alternate history role-playing game. It's typically card-based. It's kind of a board game RPG hybrid. And in the game, it is a fully GM-less game. So there's no overarching like GM role. And when you play the game, there are different character sheets, some of which have like leadership roles designated for them. Like there's one that's kind of, it's called the duty, so it's more of like an officer role, and stuff like that. But there, aside from that, which you can play without, there's no real like required structure in the group. So basically, like, you can be playing like a partisan and a rookie and a veteran and everything, and none of them necessarily have to be leaders in any particular fashion, except perhaps in the way I talk about shared leadership and like team-based leadership, where you co-lead. Like they're all working together, all of them making decisions and doing things strategically in the tank and whenever you do your role-playing. But no one actually necessarily has a leadership role over the others. And it works great. There are leaders in the narrative, so like there are other officers and stuff like that that we'll interact with that are NPCs. And so that is one of the ways to still have like a leadership kind of role, like someone who's making those decisions above you. And there's also, you know, opportunities where we pass around leadership decision making even during combat, so that you can like have everybody having the opportunity to make a choice and be in charge. And that means everyone from, you know, the rookie to the veteran to the duty gets to, you know, decide something, to be in charge. And I don't think that you need to have specific team leaders or party leaders in any kind of game unless it's specifically designed for that. Like D&D isn't actually designed to have a team leader of any kind, a party leader. We put that in place on our own because as individuals, we, seek a way to have a final decision made on things. And that's partially cultural, I think, in a lot of places, because I know in some places they're less likely to do that culturally. But, like, I don't think you ever have to have that. I think that's an option that you can, choose to engage with, having a leadership role, or you can choose to allow leadership to be divided amongst the whole group in different ways. You can choose to rotate leadership, or you can choose to not have, leadership at all, but it's still going to, believe it or not, develop in any absence of formality. Like, any formal absence of leadership will be met with people developing their own. Because leadership is something that's available to all of us. And when we're playing these games, if we see an opportunity to develop leadership skills, a lot of the time we take it, even if we aren't people who normally would want to be a leader. Because leadership skills are broad and various, and they're really useful. So I don't think you have to have them, and I don't think even if you decide not to have them that you will develop necessarily an individual leader. I think that people will find leadership, and that's pretty cool. Just gonna quickly take notes. War of Alliance has no particular constant leadership. And allows to take leadership roles, leadership skills without. Okay. So that was a really good question, because like it is totally a valid thing to wonder about, and I'm happy I got the chance to talk about it a little. So thank you again to anyone who stopped in chat. I really appreciate it. Anyone who's watching, it means a lot to me to have people kind of watching and following what I'm doing. I am literally here for you, so I appreciate it. The next question that I had from Ray is, how can we explore narratives about mutiny or rebellion against corrupt leadership? So there are a couple of ways to do this. And like some of it depends on like what you really want to focus on, like what your goal is. Like if you want to have players experience being rebelled against, that is something I would have a hard time advising. Because it would, you'd have to have unjust or just choices, like reasons that people would rebel against them that make sense and stuff like that. And you could do it, but I think it would be a challenging thing to do for the enjoyment of the players. And I think that, if you're coming at it from, making your players into the bad guys, effectively, I think that that's a really delicate place to walk, and that I would suggest taking great care in doing that. And of course using consent mechanics and having long discussions with your players about their comfort level with that kind of thing. But as far as having non-PC corrupt leadership and mutiny and stuff like that, I think that it's probably a lot easier than it sounds. Because, like, inherently, like, a lot of gamers are into resistance. And fighting the man and all of that stuff. Legitimately so, you know. Um, and I think that it is important, like, that we identify what kind of goals and ideals we have that would make us resist. So, first thing I would do is find out what your players and your characters by those players care about. So, doing, like, if you go to the values episode of Leading with Class, we have a exercise about, like, identifying your own values. And you can use those in character, too. You can have the exercise done by, you know, a character instead of in the player. And, like, what does the, you know, that character truly care about? What would be enough to make them resist? What would be enough to make them rebel? And, like, those totally, like, legit things. One thing is to make sure that you establish fair boundaries with everyone so that you aren't doing something that is so repulsive to them they cannot enjoy the game. Like, I know that one thing that a lot of people try to do to establish, like, how bad a bad guy is they'll have them do something like slavery or sexual assault. And for me, I don't even want to play the game anymore if that's, like, what's brought up. If that's the thing that I'm supposed to be rebelling against. Of course I'm going to want to rebel against it, but also I don't want to, like, engage anymore because that's not fun for me. So it's about finding the boundaries that are, like, where people are willing to engage. And so, like, finding out what people's values are, finding out what their characters' values are, places where those overlap is really fun because you can engage people more deeply and genuinely. And you can focus on, like, the fact that, like, these corrupt leaders, I hesitate to ever call anyone a leader if they're corrupt and bad, you kind of present them as, you know, violating these things that these people care about. And, you know, give a structure for how they can resist. People will find ways to, you know, reject corrupt leadership. But they also may need some help understanding, like, how you're allowing them to do so. Like, maybe you want to play a game without violence, but you want people to resist against corrupt leadership. And what you can do there is you can make it so here are your roles as players. Like, your characters are all office workers. And you know that the leader is doing bad things that are, you know, endangering people and causing harm. So basically, you have to use what's at your disposal, these nonviolent bureaucratic means, to address a rebellion, to, like, cause a rebellion. And those kind of restrictions can be much more interesting than just saying, you know, just blow everything up. It's sometimes more interesting to approach things from a restricted way than give people, you know, fully free reign for how they can resolve a problem. Especially if you know, do something like in one of the episodes that I just recorded that isn't up yet, you could create a kind of code of ethics for your PCs. So you still have them resist and rebel, but they have to do so while, you know, following their own code of ethics in their organization or something like that. Just like in Epidiah Ravichal's game that he's currently working on, which is called Lincoln Green, where you play kind of Robin Hood characters. And so you are rebelling, and you're doing so with your own boundaries and rules to follow. And I think that that's actually really a fascinating thing to do. So there's a lot of ways to explore these, you know, these narratives, like, but I think a lot of it is about setting boundaries in character and out of character about what's important to you. Like, identify your values, but also identify your limits. And communicate with each other about these things. And try to make it interesting by, giving limitations of types to make people have to make harder choices. They don't necessarily have to be fighting, the worst baddie of all time whenever they can, simply fight against the, second worst and do it in a kind of clever way. And that way you have more story to explore. Don't start with the worst of all evils. If you're going to ever fight them, work your way up a little bit. I think that can be a more interesting build. But that's just my perspective in regards to that. So work your way up to the worst if you ever encounter the worst. And establish boundaries with players and PCs, and establish the values of players and PCs. Aim for overlaps, and focus on ways to restrict the way they can respond to these corrupt threats, and make it interesting by giving them ethical boundaries that they have to work within. So that's something. I hope it's a good response. Ken, if you're still here, definitely let me know what you think of that, because I'd love to hear your perspective. So, you have about 10 minutes left or so. 10, maybe 15. Depending on whether we happen to get any last minute questions or anything. So, I think that I am going to address this last question from Ray, which is, when leadership is needed, but people are reluctant to take it, how can we choose a leader? So assigning leadership is sometimes necessary, but it is almost always kind of messy. Sometimes you simply have to give someone a leadership role, and in that case, do your utmost to make sure that they're competent and have integrity. Choosing a leader depends so much on the situation, because leadership is a much more situational thing than we think. So I talk about situational leadership in one or two of the episodes, and situational leadership is basically when you change your style of leadership and your behaviors to accommodate the current situation in the way that is most effective and best for the situation. And that's kind of how it has to operate when you're choosing a leader too, especially if you have a whole bunch of people who don't want to do the job. So if you have a room full of people and, none of the 5 people in front of you want to take the lead, the first thing you have to do is find out which ones are actually going to do it if they're chosen. So if people are just going to bail out and not have integrity to their commitments, like if they're assigned the task and they just completely quit, they're not the person you want to choose. And you also want to look for people who can actually meet the needs of the leadership role that you have. So if you have, these various expectations for your leaders, like maybe they need to be able to do strategic combat. Maybe they need to be able to do charismatic, engagement and transformative kind of leadership where they change people's minds. These are things that you have to consider. Can the person even actually do the job? And so once can the person do the job? If given the job, will this person do the job? then you have to make sure that it's not going to cause harm to put that person into the authoritative role. If they're a vindictive person who, when assigned the role, is going to turn back on everyone and be unkind or disrespectful, then you don't want to put them in that role. So it's a series of questions that you have to ask yourselves to kind of ensure that these people are going to be able to do the job, do it fairly, do it justly, and do so in a way that will not cause harm, and that isn't basically like, I'm just going to give up at some point. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can like ask these questions of people, but like looking at prior behavior is always valuable. Giving them a test run is also useful. But remember that, you know, leadership can also be shared, and so you can distribute out the tasks and leadership decisions and everything to be done by a group rather than an individual, so that you're not putting all of the pressure on someone who doesn't want to do it. It takes a lot of time to like engage everyone to do these things, but it's infinitely better sometimes to have shared responsibilities and shared leadership rather than one person who hates what they're doing and is just going to bail out the minute they get the opportunity. So that's how I would say to approach that is, you know, identify the person who can do it, who will do it, and, you know, who won't cause harm in doing it. And also consider the option of distributing out the role so that it is less pressure on one individual who has a high likelihood of failing because of their reluctance. I hope that was useful and enjoyable to follow with. I'm just going to put a note here that you want someone who can do it, will do it, and won't hurt anyone while doing it. Consider shared rules and shared leadership and responsibilities instead to ease failure points. Cool. So I'm gonna give a minute to chat in case anyone had any remaining questions for me with the last couple of minutes of the stream today. And if you do, please put them in there and I will respond. I'm just gonna give a couple of minutes to hear what you have to say. Thank you. I think I need to eventually do a video about shared leadership to kind of talk about that, but it probably will be a while because I have a lot of other stuff in the pipeline already. It's just actually getting it done with my health and timeline. I am hoping to get this video put up on YouTube. I think I'm gonna go ahead and use part of my evening to work on that. Just in the background have stuff loading up so that I can kind of address that more directly whenever I want to share it with people in the future. All right. Well, if we have no questions, and it looks like that's all, folks. I'm gonna go ahead and end this for the evening. I do appreciate everyone who came to listen. I really hope you enjoyed this stream and my responses to Arlene and Ray's questions. And again, if you ever have questions, you can put them on Twitter or Instagram or on patreon.com/leadingwithclass, and also on our YouTube. And you can email any comments that you would like to share to leadingwithclass@gmail.com. On Twitter, we are leadingwclass, and on Instagram, we are leadingwithclass. And we're Leading with Class on Patreon as well. We do not yet have a custom URL for YouTube. If you like what I've done here and you like the other episodes, please subscribe to the channel so that we can go ahead and get one of those. Make us a little bit easier to search and find, and hopefully have a little bit more positive success come to the show. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate all of the questions that were sent in. Hope you have a wonderful evening.